Thank you, Father Peter. Usually when I give a lecture, I have 2 pointers and about 100 slides in 5 minutes, but bear with me. I'd like to tell you a story. I'm not quite sure how I get onto the next slide, but there it is. This goes back about 50 years. That's how long I've been in Canada. My roommate at Loyola College, I just arrived with $1,500 in my pocket and a one-way ticket. They wouldn't even let me board Air Canada nowadays, but in those days it was different. My roommate, whose name I will not mention, joined the Society as Student for Democratic Society. You remember, 1968, and the Democratic Convention was in Chicago. And there were tear gas and a few arrests. He came back behaving somewhat weird. I didn't know what it was all about. He was smoking something, and we were sharing a flat downstairs. My landlord called me up and looked at me in the eye, and with a very stern ultimatum, either he goes or you both go. So he went, and I stayed. That was 50 years ago. We are still friends, by the way. He's in Montreal, and I'm here. Thank goodness we were 500 kilometers apart. I went to Denver, Colorado, and little did I know that they allow recreational marijuana as well there. So that was my first and only encounter of a strange kind. There were a couple more with this weed or grass. A year later, the Lane Commission on the Non-Medical Use of Drugs was called and came back with his report 3 years later, including a chapter on cannabis, believe it or not, 1972. So why say no? The problem of recreational marijuana. I would like to start with a brief, what I call the subtitle, Cannabis, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. What are the issues at stake in medical indications for cannabis? And I've used the term cannabis and marijuana interchangeably, correct me if I'm wrong. So what are the medical indications for marijuana, particularly the tetrahydrocannabinol, THC for short, and the more recently found 2,4-dihydrocannabinol, or CBD for short. What are the main concerns for recreational cannabis? What are some of the long-term adverse effects, especially in young people like us? I'm young, see, I just retired. And what are the frequently asked questions regarding legalization of recreational marijuana in less than a month's time? And what are some of the conclusions we may draw at this early stage regarding recreational cannabis? Ontario just passes regulations about selling marijuana in the corner smoke shop, but it wouldn't happen until next spring. And then I'd like to end with a quote from my favorite Canadian physician in the art of medicine. So without much more ado, cannabis, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Historically, cannabis sativa, the plant, has over 100 active ingredients. And the two major ones that you are familiar with, perhaps more than I, the psychoactive THC, and we think to some extent, I have an audience there helping me, and we think the therapeutic effect of CBD, which act at central receptors, CB1, which is directly affected in the central nervous system, and CB2, which acts at the peripheral nervous system, but also the immune system and a few other tissues. What are the pathophysiological changes that allow the dual action of THC and CBD in restoring a balance between the excessive excitation, such as mediated by excitatory amino acids, glutamate, aspartate, and also the inadequate inhibition, such as mediated by gamma aminobutyric acid and glycine in the central nervous system. The role of the endogenous cannabinoid system is not completely understood. Is it to keep a balance between excessive excitation, dampening down, as it were, the tendency to the brain to have seizures, or to restore inhibition and result in a balance? There's a possible role of CBD in the prevention of psychotic behavior versus the psychoactive THC. I like to think of it as the yin and the yang in Chinese mythology, if you like, what Claude Bernard would call the milieu intérieur, and what Cannon would call the wisdom of the body, and what I prefer, Charles Sherrington's conceptualization of the integrative action of the nervous system. So what are some of the issues at stake in trying to understand the medical indications for marijuana? For many years, going back 50 years or more, we have no resource to randomized controlled trials, the gold standard to releasing new drugs on the North American market, RCT for short, until a couple of years ago. There are no dose-response characteristics developed. The pediatric indications are not well defined, nor are the dosages used, although that's been corrected in the last 2 years. And the mechanisms of action on both CB1 and CB2 are not completely worked out, as do the direct action and the indirect sequelae. The routes of human entry need to be clarified. Do we take it by mouth? Do we inhale it, as in smoking a joint? Or is there oil? Some of the young children taking CBD oil, for example, refuse to smoke a joint. They're only 2 or 3 years old. And, or should it be injected, as in the parenteral source? And there are very few controls, because this is the most ubiquitous and perhaps frequently used or abused drug on the Canadian market, if I read the literature right. And drug-naive controls are hard to come by, mostly dropouts from control studies. So having discussed some of the issues, what are some of the demonstrated efficacies in medical indications for marijuana? I'm a pediatric neurologist with a special interest in epilepsy, and I'm pleased to report to you in the last 2 years in the famous New England Journal of Medicine, 2 randomized controlled trials. One in the young children with epileptic encephalopathies known as Dravet syndrome, and the other Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And there's a spelling error there. That's Epidiolex, which is released in the US by the FDA earlier this year. And I believe we can obtain it for compassionate use in Canada with a medical prescription, of course, and monitoring. The effective dose, as published by the American Epilepsy Society, is 2.5 milligrams per kilo per day in 2 divided doses usually to start, and a maximum dose between 10 and 20 milligrams per kilo per day maintenance, monitoring for efficacy, that is seizure control, adverse effects, dizziness, sleepiness, and the like, and possible development of tolerance. This just came out in the AES, American Epilepsy Society guidelines. For a somewhat longer period of time, spasticity as in the increased muscle tone in multiple sclerosis and cerebral palsy, has been tested and found to respond to a greater or lesser degree with marijuana. And there are other potential indications as well. Neuropathic pain, post-herpetic neuralgia, such as shingles, that could be the worst pain you have ever experienced. Fibromyalgia, diabetic neuropathy, HIV/AIDS, and sciatica can have pain of neurologic origin that respond to marijuana. And not confined to the nervous system, but systematically, cancer treatment and its after effects, chemotherapy, radiation, causing nausea, vomiting, anorexia, weight loss, cachexia, and I'll come back to this point. And a few lesser indications that I would put in the fine print because they have not been proven in randomized controlled trials, but have been tested. I draw your attention to the new DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, number 5, listed several disorders, cannabis user dependency or CUD, and cannabis user withdrawal effect. In other words, there is a risk of dependency from cannabis. What are some of the long-term consequences that raise concern, especially in view of the threatening availability of recreational cannabis? Some of it is not known. Some feel that higher cognitive function, such as playing video games, may be accelerated. I'm not sure about that. Baby Einstein again. The reaction time may be impaired, so operation of a motor vehicle, use of power, machinery, tools. One of the questions raised that I didn't find the answer to was whether somebody controlling a drone can be affected in the operation of the drone, and what happens if they were targeting the enemy. The Canadian Armed Forces came up with guidelines. No marijuana for at least 48 hours before going on duty, and if you are in a mission-critical situation, such as in a submarine or flying a plane, no contact with marijuana for at least 28 days. Now, how are they going to enforce that? That's another issue. The Toronto Public Health has also came up with guidelines, which I will elaborate. They just came out last week with guidelines for the non-medical cannabis legalization and regulation for health care professionals. So my understanding is law enforcement agencies across the country are being trained and instructed how to detect roadside screening tests comparable to the breathalyzer for alcohol, and how to determine definitive urine or blood test results to confirm or possibly to convict the user. What is not known would be the interaction of other CNS active drugs, alcohol, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and more the opioids, especially fentanyl, on the market. Tragically, we've lost almost 4,000 Canadians in the past year from opioid overdose. The long-term side effects are also not clear, especially in the young children and adolescents, youth with a developing nervous system. Impact on learning, memory, and education, and quality of life. And finally, safety in the fetus or the infant brain in development should the mother consume, inhale, or imbibe during pregnancy or nursing mothers on cannabis. So with that, with a precaution, we have some issues. The developing brain continues to mature, as you all know, and sometimes I feel I'm on the other side of the hill going down the other way. Neurogenesis continues in certain parts of the brain, particularly the olfactory bulb, the hippocampus, cerebellar nuclei, and psychoactive agents can, in fact, brain MRI changes have been found, but are they reversible? And what are the long-term side effects on cognitive function, psychological outcome? So with that, there are some unanswered questions, and I think you can, we have to be careful about acute schizophreniform psychosis, family history, previous history, history of substance abuse, prior exposure, and of course young children, and the upper age limit at which cannabis is, quote, safe is not completely determined. And it's better to be safe than sorry as far as early exposure is concerned. Frequently asked questions, and here I bow to the expertise of Mr. Whitmore about the legalization of recreational marijuana, interaction with drugs, what are the circumstances that may allow the use of cannabis as quote-unquote the lesser of two evils, marijuana versus fentanyl or alcohol versus marijuana. And when does the end, making money? Some of the companies are increasing the shares on the stock market by leaps and bounds overnight, literally. And what are the consequences? Young people becoming dependent. Would the use of marijuana be acceptable in medical assistance in the dying, so-called aid, MAID, or in palliative care subjects such as terminal care for metastatic cancer? And when recreational marijuana is legalized, would it be morally justified? I asked the question. The Toronto Public Health came with legalization and the non-medical cannabis legalization and regulation directed to healthcare professionals a week ago, and this is a summary that you can read for yourself, and it's available online from the Toronto Medical Officer of Health. In conclusion, medical marijuana may be indicated in a few narrowly defined disorders of the nervous system, epilepsy refractory to standard drugs, severe spasticity due to inflammation or brain-injured disorders, neuropathic pain, or in terminal cancer with toxicity. Recreational marijuana may become legalized in the near future, but does not make it justified to use for the buzz that it generates. The adverse effects are numerous, and interactions with other drugs, including alcohol and narcotics, are incompletely known. The profit motive should not induce this widespread use for the high it produces. When asked to take a joint, just say no. I want to thank my co-speakers, especially Father Peter's invitation, Dr. Maura McQueen, who's coming up, and my collaborator, Dr. Professor McBurnham, Professor Emeritus of Pharmacology at the University of Toronto, and the rest you can read for yourself. A quote from Sir William Osler, who was Professor of Medicine at McGill, wrote Equanimitas, and then became professor at Penn State University of Pennsylvania, then Johns Hopkins Medical School, before ending up at the Radcliffe Infirmary at Oxford. He who studies medicine without books sails an uncharted sea, but he who studies medicine without patience does not go to sea at all. I want to thank you for your attention.
Very good. So there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards.